Charles E. Gannon. I'm going to call him Chuck. That's what I know him.
I know now a lot of you, a lot more than I knew when I came the day before yesterday, absolutely.
All right, well, good deal. My job is to get Chuck talking. So, yeah, this is not a hard job. Here's Chuck.
Your role here is probably to get me to stop.
That's his job. We'll start at the beginning. How did your parents meet?
They said, we don't really love each other, but we want to have a pairing that will produce a long-winded writer. This seems good. So
It was meant to
it was meant to be, that's right.
All right, so you write mostly first person, is that correct? All right, but a more serious question then. What did you want to be when you grew up?
Have I told you this one?
I don't think so.
Okay, so this just shows you, I guess, this was indeed fated to be, and in retrospect, it's as clear as day. So the first thing I remember wanting to be, I was 3 or a little bit earlier, and I wanted to be a paleontologist, and I wanted to write that. And then I sort of moved away from dinosaurs, but I really liked zoology, and I think I read Wind in the Willows or something like this, and these other sort of, these sort of gold medal child books which had, rabbits running around doing, human things fundamentally.
That plus the Island of Dr. Moreau.
This is not a Gothic tale. So by 8, I wanted to, I think, be a zoologist and write about it. What those little animal tales had to do with zoology just shows you that although I knew I wanted to write about it, know these things didn't keep me from a huge measure of naivete. At, I think, about 10, I wanted to be an astronomer and write about it because that seemed really cool. Then, astronaut. And then I realized, oh, damn, you could really die easily doing that. So I said, but I still like that space travel stuff. I want to write about it. And then I realized that as I grew older and that naivete quotient sort of like dropped off a little bit, I realized that what almost all these things had in common was you spend 98 or 99% of your time doing very often repetitive, detail-oriented work and practicing for a 1% payoff, which was extraordinary and huge and spectacular and life-changing, but then you go back to the presentation again. And then I said, I could just write about it. And that was about age 12, and I knew that, and the first thing I started writing, I'd written other things a little bit along the way, but I started writing something which in its mannerisms and its scope and in its ambitions is what, if you go into the dealer room, you'll find there, and I guess that the juvenilia does show through. But I hope not. That was supposed to be a joke, but no one laughed. Terrified. That means you've read it. But I mean, none of those ideas have stuck there. But the idea of moving outward and what that means and how that changes us and what we find was right there from the very beginning. So I was a big fan of Star Trek, the original series. Which I liked for not being smug, which I felt sort of got imported into the franchise in its next iteration. I know I probably lost half the audience, but I have to say that
it's okay to have opinions.
Yeah. The thing that I like the problems and the troubles that were in the original series. I thought they were more relevant to what I wanted to write anyhow, and so that was how it started.
So you always wanted to be a science fiction writer?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
How long did it take you?
This would be good for a motivational panel.
Because there were many other stops along the way.
There really were. Although, and here, see, I was born a Catholic. I had my retirement card at age 12, but I still have a tendency towards confessional gestures, so that's what I'm doing at this point. I confess that the first thing that I actually wrote that actually saw, I guess, any readership beyond myself was...
You don't have to talk about the pornography, that's fine.
Oh, I'll leave that to Mike Resnick and Silverberg. They tell the better stories. Exactly right.
I am kidding.
It's only $20. I'm not going to pay you for that. Was actually in science fiction fanzines. Specifically, if anybody in this will really show your age and your origins, if you remember a Star Trek fanzine called Berengaria,
Yeah.
Bing, you lose on the self-revelation contest. Okay, it was amazing. For me, it was amazing. It's the day when you know the height of technology is the Mimeo machine. You know, blue forms and blue inks are on everybody's hands, and so I had actually they started me with I started off with a series. Can you believe it? And the first 4 were right there. Then Barry Gary ran into problems, and they took a hiatus. By the time they came back from the hiatus, I was doing other things, but I remember getting it in the mail. As one did in those days.
Who were the Berengaria people?
I can't remember anymore.
Do you
I can't remember.
Yeah, all right.
But I should say that I had a wonderful mentor who just sort of took me on her wing. I showed up for a thing in very near my house. Those of you who are from New York might remember Spring Valley. Spring Valley had a public library, and I went there for somebody who was talking about Star Trek and her work in it. And that person was Jacqueline Lichtenberg. And I came up to her after, and I said, this has been really great, and we talked for maybe about 4 minutes, and she said, you have to send me something. I said, and I did, and she wrote the letter that if Tony had ever seen would now hate, which is, she wrote me, it was 5 pages, single-spaced type, okay? It was long, and she wrote the first page was, you did this wrong, you can't do that, this is repetitive, structural, this scene was not needed, and then I turn it over, and 1 paragraph in, she says the things that everybody would want to hear, which is, I tell you all this to leaven what comes now. There are about 9,000 things you do right that you just have an instinct, you've been reading or something like that. And so you know, it was like the Marine Corps. We break you down to build you up, you know. And along the way, you know, I learned that she was, believe me, I didn't go forward with that attitude, retaining it all the way. For that, I have lots of people to tell me how much more I always have to learn. But that's always been my attitude towards it. Has been everything I do is for me the opportunity to learn the next step. I don't believe there's any end to development in this.
Yeah, and that's the kind of people I like to work with, that, you know, are always looking to improve and learn more things and take that next step and go forward. And that's, I mean, that is a lovely thing as an editor and a publisher. It is more important as a reader. You know, when you find authors who are like that, who are not content to just do the same thing over and over again, but who improve, and that's what you want as a reader. You know, that's the kind of thing you want. You want to be able to dive into that author and go, oh, and now I'm buying everything he's ever written. That's what you want.
Please. Absolutely, and that directed a lot of my reading as well. I was from the moment I ran into Heinlein, I was a fan, and actually not so much because of the competent man model. Not that I dislike the competent man model. As a matter of fact, I guess what you could say in my series, in an updated version, that's actually one of the things I'm trying to go with. I think that so for those of you who don't know, I do a little bit of advising inside the Beltway and in the 5-sided squirrel cage. And one of the things that I've learned there is that any person you've ever seen, any character that's ever been accused of being a Mary Sue, I've run into people who make them look like pikers. Honest to God. And the notion that...
Explain Mary Sue.
Okay, folks, so Mary Sue is essentially the cipher for the idealized version of the author, or a perfect character who is sort of the Übermensch, if you will, or Uberfräulein, I guess, or Uberfrau, as the case may be. And I certainly don't do that, but I certainly do believe this, and I've seen the evidence of this time and time again. While I can find and have read many narratives where the protagonist is constantly stewing in the juices of their own psychic trauma, those are generally not the people who, in organizations where you have to be able to respond to a call decisively, quickly, and be able to tuck that stuff, all that human stuff that they still have, and put it in a bag and say, I'll unpack this later. People who can't do that tend not to make it to those points in the decision-making or action process. They just don't. And I sometimes kind of feel that there's a readership out there that doesn't believe that believes that somehow everybody is ready to slit their wrists in the bathtub when certain things go awry. And I think that we all deal with it, but we deal with it in different ways. And I would feel it is unrealistic to put characters in these positions who are not able to manage the angst long enough so that it does not critically impede what they must do in the moment. And so I guess that's one of the reasons why I say and I actually feel that Heinlein did a good job with that. I don't see his characters as being Mary Sues or Marty Stews, as they say, as much as people like to say. So I guess I'm a bit of a, so I started out liking dinosaurs and I've become one, I guess.
That's the spirit. Well, no, I think the thing that you and Heinlein both share is that you've actually met these people. You've traveled in these circles. You have met extremely competent people. You have met people who are at the tops of organizations. You have met the doers, and it's not essential to write about them, but I think it is helpful. So you know that they're real.
Yeah.
And that's and that I think it helps. I think it can help a writer have more confidence in their own writing if they have seen and done things.
Oh, yes.
I don't think it's necessary. I'm thinking of the 19-year-old futurians who who know nothing, right? And they're writing these great things.
Yeah.
And that's fine because they're thinking about stuff. But I think it can be helpful when you're attacking a story yourself to have the confidence in knowing, okay, yes, this is real. Although I was having a story conference with a young writer on Thursday. He had sent in a manuscript and we were rejecting it, but I wanted to encourage him. And I said, look, this reads funny. It just doesn't read right. And he said, well, but it's real. I actually have this thing. And I'm like, I don't care. It doesn't matter if it's real. It doesn't read real. It reads fake. It reads like you're putting it in there because you need it to be in there, and that's a no-no. Yeah. How did I get onto that? Moving on back to Chuck.
We can stay here. I'm very comfortable with this. Go on.
In the daily newsletter, you talked about some novels that some of your favorite novels and your formative novels.
The daily newsletter.
Yeah, there's
The source.
Oh, okay. That could the
convention.
I did those interviews on Facebook. Right, got it. Yep. I know. Okay.
It's printed now. For me, it's real now. Outside of science fiction, what were your formative works? It doesn't, not necessarily fiction, but nonfiction too. What would you say?
Oh, I would say first of all, I was largely formed by fiction. Really.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Storytelling. There was almost nothing. Yes, I've taught this stuff. I've read philosophy. I've read art philosophy. I'm a professor. I still have my credentials. I taught full time, tenured from 98 to 2007. So I've been up and down that tree, but I find that there is almost no philosophy text direct. And again, I don't mean to make enemies here, but the bottom line is that which fits into a story means it's being married at the hip, at least, to human emotion and human experience. And that is, I think, the important thing for me. And I'll give you an example, which comes from actually kind of my academic side. There's an interesting study that was done about American knowledge of the consequences of atomic and nuclear weaponry. And all through the 40s and into the early 50s, you see that there's all of this newspaper coverage on it, and there's the Saturday Review, and they're doing all this stuff, and Americans are sort of not getting it. And they would do polls. If this happens, what does this mean? What does this term mean? What would that mean? Et cetera, et cetera. Not very. Then you get to a sequence of non-news items. You get On the Beach. You get Failsafe. You get Alas, Babylon. And those polls changed dramatically. And I remain convinced that it's because when you put a human in an environment, the effect is not a bunch of numerals, but it's a bunch of things. It is the depiction of the horror, the flame, the uncertainty, the fact that the world is changing around you, both the physical and the psychological trauma of the event. And all of a sudden, the numbers come along for the ride. Why? Because the human intellect is primed to say, I mean, we're here because we survived. That's what we were good at, obviously. I mean, obviously, the intelligent muskrats are not here to make the rebuttal right now. Unless I missed something. But that movement out of the corner of the eye, that was a little creepy. But it's when we're suddenly activated that way that these numbers, which just sort of floated in the abstract, now actually have something solid to lock onto. And that, to me, was why I wanted to write stories. When I was in college, I remember thinking, there are really three kinds of power or influence in the world, when you get right down to it. One is economic. It's money. Follow the money. The second one really is political, because whether you're a general that's taking over a political role or otherwise, the bottom line is physical force is essentially politics at the smallest level. And then there's, if you will, the influence of ideas. I like to think of the influence of ideas as what they call, I love how they call gravity, and it is in one way, the weak force. The weak force that drives everything in the cosmos. The difference is the time over which it operates and also how much you must amass, and it's subtle. And that's kind of what I think about ideas. And it's one of the reasons why when I had an abortive first career, through no act of my own, I went to teaching. That was my plan B. And the good news about teaching was I was producing academic materials, I was pretty good at it. The bad news was I was pretty good at it. Which means that you get dragged in on the summer stuff and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and suddenly it takes, I had this, and yeah, 4 kids. That's another problem. In terms of time availability, love them to death. My other great creative and important project, I feel, but it was more of a sidetrack than I thought it was going to be.
Well, we'll talk about your first career.
The first career. Well, the first career was fundamentally TV, and it was freelance writing. And about 1988, I saw in a game that I believe Tony and I both have in common, experientially, Traveler, what had some holes in it about some stuff I knew a little bit about, and there were, I thought, huge play opportunities to be found there. And so I wrote an article for a class of an intelligence operative, and then wrote an adventure for it. If anybody is going to see has read any of my fiction, this may begin to sound eerily familiar. There I am, the dinosaur again, just can't change, damn it. But they picked up both things, and they said, send us more. So then I started writing for Game Design Workshop, and I did an awful lot of work in a bunch of their product lines, looking out in the audience. If we have gamers here, actually will recognize titles such as Traveler, Mega Traveler, Twilight 2000, 2300 AD, Dark Conspiracy. Yeah, you can find my name on all of that stuff. In the meantime, sometime around 1990, because I become a member of SFWA because you could, and it hadn't been formalized yet. But the person who was in charge of membership said, this qualifies. You've written enough. You've made this much money. Fine, off you go. So I'm getting that, and so I get my hands, greedy little hands, on something called Market Report, which still exists in the SFWA bulletin, which was really, really the nexus. That was the bourse in those days. The field was, I guess you could say, small enough in these sort of really pre-internet days, and the venues well enough established that if anybody really did want to put solicitations out there, this was one of the places they were going to definitely do it. And so I ran across something by an author I already loved. Jerry Purnell he had something for High Tech Wars. He had, I think, come out with one anthology in it, and no, he was looking to fill the first anthology. By the time I got around to write something, which actually was the precursor to Not For Ourselves Alone. That was the modified version of it. I just can't get away from all those fossils. I sent it to him for that, and he said, we filled it up, we might be doing another one, I can't use that, but can you write something else? And one of the things you've learned if you're a writer, in terms of being flexible regarding your own skill level and thinking and knowing there's always room to improve, is when somebody says, I don't have the music for this dance, but I could play a different song. You say, hit it, and you groove. You groove. And so that's what I did. And if you go back and you look at Warworld Invasion, I have 2 pieces in that. And at the same time, I came under contract for, in that universe, they had to do a reboot because the baddies that were supposed to be the perpetual problem there, the Saurons, Harry Turtledove, S.M. Sterling, and Susan Schwartz, had essentially totally defanged them, neutered them, and sent them packing to bed without dinner. So
they solved the problem.
they did. They really did. So John Carr, who actually I rarely worked with Jerry, the packager for this anthology and almost all of us was John Carr, who's a great guy, a wonderful person to work with, very, very supportive of new writers. And he said, look, we need to reboot this. I don't know what to do. Well, in one of my stories, I'd had a bunch of the, quote, genetic defectives amongst the Sauron sort of leave the Sauron clan and go over to a different continent, which had never been explored.
Actually, just very quick sidebar. Steve Hickman, who's the artist guest of honor, did the most disturbing cover ever for that War World.
Which one?
He did the one with the Sauron on the cover, where he instead of using a human face to model it, he used an orangutan. Oh, that was creepy. Anyway.
Ladies and gentlemen, Tony Weisskopf. But really, I mean, I got nothing for all that.
I just wonder if it was for your story.
No. What happened was we signed a letter of agreement for me to do a novel. It was going to be me and Jerry, or me and John, or something like that. And it was going to be set on the East Continent. Okay. At the same time, GDW has approached me to write a tie-in novel for Traveler and a tie-in novel for Dark Conspiracy. And how you're looking for it now, aren't you? Yeah. No, Invasion is actually is the sort of thing which would be considered female exploitative these days, I think. It's one of those covers. Oh, later on, you have to get her to let me tell you the story of, I think it was the first Nebula nomination, the ad you wanted to run. You remember it? Yeah, she remembers it, all right.
Yes, I did.
Those were halcyon. Yeah.
Because calmer heads.
And the fact that I pleaded, yeah, that was one.
Yeah. All right, this is not the cover that I was thinking of. This is the
No, that's quite normative.
Yeah.
Really, that's a very normative science fiction.
Yeah.
But so at any rate, I had that, and then I had these 2 other works for hire under contract. This occurred in the space of about 16 months, and I had to go to the TV folks and say, can you guys let me go more part-time now, because this is what I've always wanted to do. I got 3 novels to write in fewer years than that. You know, I'm rolling for that. So what can we do? And they said, well, we were about to bring you on full-time because that's what we need. So thanks, good luck. Don't let the door hit you in the butt on the way out. And that was it. I was done.
Well, how did you start in TV?
I started in TV by having studied it. I got a degree. I wasn't going to go the college route, but I studied it. And it was one of and the reason I went to TV was, yeah, I like the visual medium, but also it's one of the things that you can look for in the Sunday New York Times classified section and say, writer wanted. That is not going to happen for a novelist. You know, if it is, that's probably hidden intelligence communications going on. You know, so it's sort of like, weather report for Tuesday, icebergs expected. Unless you live in Reykjavik, probably not. So I knew that this was, if I was going to make a wage at writing, it was probably going to be in television. Okay. I also did look at publishing though. So I went sort of both ways on that. So that's how I got started in TV. Most of that was absolutely nonfiction. I had some really interesting clients, taught me a lot. I'm not even going down that path.
Oh, come on. Now you have to.
No, okay. So I want to see the age in here. Okay, I'm comfortable with this. So this joke encapsulates really the entirety of what I learned. Sorry about this. I know there are TV projects out there. I've been involved with them. I said I had a confessional streak. Here we go. There's a joke that sort of encapsulates the entirety of the lesson I learned in television, not including the narrative ones. So the joke goes, what's the difference between a pool full of sharks and a pool full of TV executives? The pool full of sharks has absolutely no pederasts in it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, see, you said go for it, I did. It's like,
Okay, so you get to associate with really cool people.
yeah, really cool people, absolutely. And I won't go into the stories. On the other hand, it taught me a lot about writing, particularly action sequences, because what you can mislead yourself into thinking that you can add things into action sequences in fiction, maybe. But when you're sitting editing film, you can't. You can't stop to explain the weapon that is just getting employed. You do not have the time, because it is absolutely unrealistic, because we're seeing it one-to-one, right? We're seeing it one-to-one. You don't have the time to suddenly break into a 2-page, mental consideration of the activities. Despite the fact that time does shrink, the bottom line is active events where human beings have to respond quickly, work as much, if you will, think your way through reflexes, if that makes any sense. Get inside the initiative cycle of the event. That means very quick editing pace. I'll give you an example of just, because you'll all be familiar with it. Hitchcock, Psycho, shower scene. As you move into that, you have long shots. As you get, when you time it, once the curtain comes back and Mom, with her hair bun, seen as shadow, is wielding the knife, that is the longest shot in all of the rest that follows. And it's something like 37 cuts, no pun intended, in 4 seconds.
Yeah.
And then, how do they come out of it? And this is another thing you learn about contrast, the contrast between tones and moods. There's that moment then when she's dead on the floor. We get that long, Jennifer Lee? Janet Lee is dead on the floor. Get that long, slow zoom back. Do you know how they did that? That's a still photograph. They wanted her deader than dead, and they got it. These are the sort of things that translate. You can translate these into fiction.
You can, and that's actually, you touched on another one of my editorial pet peeves, is that people, they write action too slow. Action happens fast, and if you are not writing fast, and that means shorter paragraphs, shorter sentences, shorter words.
Just like shots, just like cuts.
Just like shots, just like cuts. Then it comes across as more action, as more immediate, and it works much better. That was actually another of the things that I was telling. Yeah.
But as Tony will be the first to tell you, that didn't mean all the habits I picked up from cinema were the right ones.
Oh, yeah.
I worked as a script doctor also. One of the things that I would say it's fair to learn is to trust my readers.
Yes.
In that television is the medium of, KISS, keep it simple, stupid. And keep, tell them what you told them, and then tell them again.
Yes.
And that's one of the things that I don't think I learned to trust my reader, and I'm still working on it though, because it's a delicate balance. And then when you're writing in a series, you have the further challenge of how much of this is essentially retreading because I'm trying to make sure this works as a standalone, but how much do I, so the questions, that's why you keep growing, because the challenges keep changing, among other things. But dialogue also. Tony sometimes would say, why don't have people ask questions all the time? It's like, well, this, well, that. If you take a look at dialogue on television, one of the things you'll see is that it's like slow pitch baseball, usually. It's questions very often are setups for excursus. Because the worst thing in the world is, and this was the habit I had to break. My habit was never stay on a talking head for more than 6 or 7 seconds. You cannot do it. It doesn't matter what their TVQ is. It doesn't matter how pretty they are. It doesn't matter how entrancing what they're saying might be. The medium is relentless and unforgiving in that regard. In a book, not at all the case, and you can get out of that. But that was one of those things. I've been trained like Pavlov's dog in terms of dialogue that way. And it was this lady who said, you shouldn't be doing this. You don't need to do this. And I remember I wrote a long email explaining why I did it and saying, at the end, there was the revelatory moment, which I'm sure, I imagine she was waiting for it, which is, but I really don't need to do that now, do I? And Tony wrote some nice, very, very nice email, which was blissfully short, which is like, that's right.
Yeah, I have really, I think probably taken Sprunk and White maybe a little too much to heart. And apparently my emails are known for their terseness, but.
They're never nasty.
Well,
TV is terse and nasty.
But yeah, no, it's, I took it, and, because you're certainly not the only writer who does this. Say something and then say it again. I mean, that's what you're taught to do when you're writing speeches or papers from college and things like that. Say what you're going to do and then do it, and then tell them what you just did. But in writing fiction, you don't want that. So as an editor, I'm very alert to just like, you said that once before, you got it good. Pick the best way that you said it of these three, and then go with that. I don't care which one it is.
Sometimes it's useful for effect.
No.
The only time I find myself doing it, I wrote a very long novel recently, longer than I had any idea it was going to be. And when
Longer than the Starfire books?
actually, yeah, and people don't feel it's long.
Good.
Kane's Mutiny, they say, when I tell them how long it is,
That doesn't seem
they
long.
say, yeah, but it's 252,000 words still. Yeah, so, well, of course, I'm in a Jordan convention, so that's like a short story. So yes, I work in the short medium.
There's a box of novellas right behind you.
But there are reasons you do it in TV, and one of them is, obviously, you can't go back. I mean, in the day when I was taught, we were fairly early into it, and still, you don't want to have to watch a television show by clicking back to see what was going on. Also, this is a terrible thing. Back when it was called, get confused. You remember what LCD used to and still means, liquid crystal diode? In television, it means something entirely different. It means lowest common denominator, and the number was 12, and the grade was B- to C+. That is the definition. If that target person cannot understand what you're doing, you are in, particularly when you were in broadcast, we grew up in New York, that was television mecca. You had all three of the major networks owned and operated, you had two big independents, you had PBS, and then you had a raft of UHF if anybody could receive it, almost no one did. But they kept on trying. But there you're dealing with a situation where you do have to tell something. The more complicated it gets, you have to parse it out into smaller bits, and you very often have to repeat the conclusions. You don't necessarily have to repeat the process whereby you got to the conclusion, but you have to repeat that. But it is, and you can tell a poorly adapted film or book because whoever did it didn't understand what this lady, I hopefully has concluded my education in this regard, but people who didn't get that memo.
Yeah. Now, I am a big fan of the denouement, I guess, where you explain what just happened and put it into context. I do like that, but that's a different thing from giving the baseball summary every time you come back from a commercial.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's when I was saying that when you sometimes do it, and when I was talking about length is because when the book gets long enough, if you drop something in at the beginning, you may have to give a prompt to say, okay, now I'm pulling this out of the weeds. You always almost have to do that, I think, in a well-written mystery.
Yes.
Because you have to hide the MacGuffin in the sea of other objects, and then you have to pull it out so that the reader is simultaneously frustrated to death, hates you, and loves you, because it's like, it was in front of me all the time.
Right, exactly.
That's the game.
Yeah, that you want that.
Yeah.
Like, I remember seeing that baseball bat team. Yeah. In your website, I'm going to quote you, storytelling is about worlds. Today the concept of a world increasingly transcends what is presented in a single book or a single film or a single game. Now a fictional world is often a multimedia alternate reality, another place and time that a reader can step into, and in doing so take a vacation from this one. And if I'm doing my job correctly, that's what you'll experience as you visit the worlds you can access through the gateways on this site. I do think that we are, I want to ask you this question. How is writing a verse, a Kane verse,
Okay.
The Ring of Fire universe, the Honorverse, Starfire, how is writing in a verse different than writing a novel or writing a short story?
I don't know because I haven't. No, and I'm not sure I'm necessarily misrepresenting myself. I always tend to think in large arc, no matter what I'm writing.
Okay, so you've always written verses.
I've written shorter things, and I think for me the difference is, it is, strangely enough, it is easiest for me to write a short story that is not part of a verse. It's easier to write a standalone short story in very compact terms because you're not world building.
Okay.
You are, as a matter of fact, I find myself, I have no idea what the expression on her face is going to be when I say this, so I'm going to close my eyes. I find it difficult to control length sometimes when I'm working in a verse. It is very hard to work under 7,000 words because if it's not being published as part of a collection that already had a story that did some setup before it, which you can do if you're doing it sort of an anthology. If you know you're heading into an anthology, you can dole out the setups for later on in the earlier stories. I've never had that fortune yet, but I know I could do it. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Not in a rush, not in a rush. And she says, me neither.
I'm just thinking about all the contracts.
Yeah, so am I. So am I. I am the luckiest guy in the world. I'm the luckiest guy in the world. I know. Okay, Tony didn't pay me to say this. She couldn't pay me enough to say this if I didn't feel it. Which is, when you do business with Tony, you do it on a handshake. And there are, I think, only really two houses that I can think of that so ardently support what I would call singles and doubles baseball. Which is, if your batting average is good and you're routinely coming close to a book scan national bestseller, or you're just paying out in the second or the first of the second period, the bottom line is, and we'll go around again, or that seems to be what I've observed. The only other place that I've seen really do that repeatedly is Dauro. Does that quite a lot. I find some interesting parallels also in terms of origins and structures. And the loyalty, therefore, to series. I mean, I am always happy when C.J. Sherry comes out with another work, and what are we in there? We're like 26 or something like that? That's something like that now. And just working with an editor who tells it straight, doesn't try to rewrite your book under you. One of the things that I feel I love, I think I'm pretty sure about this, and then the people I work with inside. Tony's paired me with one. I'm absolutely so lucky that I'm working with editors and collaborators who their attitude is, I don't want to rewrite this if it needs rewriting. You rewrite it. I almost don't understand why anybody would do it any other way, because if you rewrite it, how is it that they've learned enough to deliver what you want in the shape you want it the next time?
Right.
And I think it's part of, I would imagine that although it's not written on the wall anyplace, and it's not it was never sent to me in a letter as frank as, show me what you can do, show me you can put on big boy pants and do these things yourself. I would have to think that somebody who is not able to do that is going to have a problematic staying relationship in any part of this industry. Bang, whatever imprint you want. And I just think that I've been so fortunate in that regard. Short fiction. Yeah, okay, coming back from Interrupt. Normally, I feel like I should wear a superhero shirt with a T, because I'm Tangent Man. That is my superpower. Yeah, right. Off we go. But now back from this elliptical orbit.
Squirrel.
Shiny muskrat.
The invisible muskrats.
See, those are the ones you gotta watch out for. Yeah, this is gonna follow me now, isn't it? Now it's gonna follow.
In a room that has yellow wallpaper.
Okay, Francis. Okay, the yellow wallpaper is making an appearance. How many times did I teach that one? I can't even remember.
I hated this.
Yeah.
I loved it.
Well, we know what the next panel is going to be. It's going to be a slam down match, I think. But at any rate, it's creepy, all right. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely is.
Now I'm going to find that Hickman picture. All right. Anyway, tangent.
So yes, or coming off the tangent. Coming off when I'm not writing in a verse.
Yes.
I'm really. It changes what I'm talking about. Because when you're writing in a verse, I tend to think, and I did a panel on this last night, we went over what a shock with me. But then when I was trying to get away, people were staying in there. And it was about the relationship, the similarities between, you, on the surface, you couldn't think of two things that would seem more different than the Kane Riordan series, let's say, and the Wheel of Time. And yet, when you're looking at Epic,
Yeah.
and the structure of Epic,
Yeah.
and when I reread the book for this time, you know, I'm reading the first 10% of that novel, and I'm saying, oh, I know what's going on here.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know why, I would say,
The
it's been,
problems you have to solve.
absolutely, the problems you have to solve and the things you have to get past, which is, so I know I'm really not talking at this moment about standalones, but standalones don't have, give you an example of great standalones. If I was gonna write standalone adventure, which is what I would probably do in a standalone, largely because that's not something where you have even the space to get into bigger issues. You might graze across them, but you have to get back to it. What drives good action is a stick. The thing behind you, the thing that must be done. In an epic, I feel it's the carrot. There's a magnet, there's something in front of you, there's a confluence of events and time and thought that is moving together, and it's pulling forward as much. There is both a magnet and a magnet-like carrot and the stick at the same thing. In Alistair MacLean, who I think may be one of the best action writers I know of, who writes extremely clean prose, excellent action, intelligent dialogue, but only when it's supposed to be intelligent dialogue, and his novels are rarely more than about 80 to 90,000 words, if ever. Guns of Navarone, Ice Station Zebra, excellent, and believe me, I went and I took my schooling from Mr. Alistair MacLean, and I use it in my action sequences. And there's just stuff you don't do. So when I write a standalone, it tends to have a point, and it tends to be more about the stick than the carrot in the final analysis. But what was fascinating about reading Eye of the World this time around, because I last read it, I read it in '93, and that is that's when that first career I was talking about, I don't think I ever said, or I think I did, all three of those novels yanked at once. So I left TV, and in the space of 7 months, all three of those novels I was supposed to write, Jerry Purnell and John Carr stopped at that point, I believe, almost all Imperial Stars, War World, There Will Be War, and high-tech wars all came to a halt. And it wasn't because of market forces, I seem to recall.
Oh, no.
And that's where we'll leave it. And there was a change of COs at GDW. And they decided, and in those days, gaming companies did not understand that when you sign a contract for something that's written, there's called a kill fee if you're not going to do the project. And so there was no promise that they were going to roll the project over into something else, and that actually not only therefore made it that I wasn't doing new projects for the new group, and the novels had been canceled. I had to go to arbitration. So that became, therefore, they weren't going to hire me when they were in arbitration with me, as nice as I tried to be. So plan B, be a professor. And once again, the world of ideas. But
Which you were very successful at.
Like I said, maybe a little too much at times, because it was a long arc back, and thank you for bringing me back. This is a place obviously where I always wanted to be, and so I read.
But you worked really, really hard to get back to it.
I worked, yes, but I think the work that I did, this is interesting because I did a podcast with John Hartness, who does a great podcast on new writers and becoming a writer, getting published and things like that. Very often what you hear in this industry is keep working your craft. And that's very often what you see as where all the energy of determination really needs to go. Now in my case it was a little different. I guess I was I didn't start very far off the mark when I came back, and I'd already had, in coming back, I'd already had lead up publications in analog and other things like that, but no tales out of school here. This lady rightly turned down Fire with Fire the first time she got it. Turned it down, not flat, and she told me in the letter, right? And told me in the letter that the Slush Master General, Ray Reinhardt, had been very ardent in his thinking that there was really something here. And I'd missed the boat, but not by a huge amount. And I was invited to send something again. Well, I knew what that meant. I was like, yeah. But what I also did was I sent a letter thanking Tony. I remember Tony writing me back very soon after and saying, it's not often an editor gets a thank you for rejection. but the thing was, I was told that, first of all, Tony wrote me it's a single page, it was a whole page letter, single spaced, about why and what was going on and why it was not accepted. And then she mentioned in the course of that Gray had something like 7 pages of notes. And I contacted and I said, may I please have those notes? And those were, now I'll say something about that I'm not sure I've ever told Tony. Writing that, first of all, I made good use of my time when I had my sabbatical. I wrote the first 2 novels in my sabbatical. Of course, I was going to a school where that would actually have counted towards my publication, so it was a win-win. But the other thing was, when I knew where I wanted to publish. I'm right where I wanted to be. If you've never heard me say that, but that's not. I knew where my audience was. I knew the sort of fiction I wanted to write. I know that in a lot of ways it has a lot of golden age aspects or mannerisms in it, but it's also been sort of, I guess you could say, I don't want to say rehabilitated, let's say refreshed with I think
It's new.
yeah, it's got different sensibilities in a lot of ways. But the fact that so many good stories were like the babies that went out with the bathwater. There are certain tropes we almost don't use anymore, and they're great tropes. And I wasn't about to say, oh well, I can't touch those because those are persona non grata. Well, and I knew there was one place where that wouldn't matter. And so that motivated me. But at the same time, I'm writing this. I have no idea if that's where it's going to. So I'm thinking of the entire market, and I'm putting in things that I've watched the editorial preferences here and the editorial preferences there. And what I sent her was, it was a Trolloc. It was a Trolloc. It was a great core organism that had chimeric extrusions coming out of it, all over the place. I mean, one of the things that I know, the fact that it was, there was a lot of flashback in it. There was a lot more sort of deviation from action to go into sort of internal monologue. I started out with the person that was a total amnesiac rather than 100 hours. And this sort of stuff yeah, exactly right. And the bottom line was, actually, that wasn't the story I wanted to write. I knew the story I wanted to write, it was there, and then I said, what do I do with it? So to some degree, the refit was, and I wasn't gonna go, see, I can say this to Tony now, because can you imagine, how predictable is this? You write this book, it almost gets accepted, but it gets turned down. You say, but really, honestly, that wasn't the book I wanted to write. The book I wanted to write is the one I want you to see now. Oh, please. But what happened was, I got teamed up with 2 collaborators who are wonderful collaborators, Steve White, Eric Flint. They could not be more different to work with, but they could not be more similar in the sense that they basically said, I trust you, run with the ball. And they were very frank, and for my part, I will say this much. As a collaborator, the first thing in my head was, your sandbox, I'm just playing in it. And that is something I think sometimes gets lost along the way. But yeah, the next time I went back, I had an agent, I had done it. The agent, I think, maybe convinced Tony that it really was a different book, and here we sit.
Yeah. Yeah, I hate rereading. I really, really do. So I will say, do not follow Chuck's path. One of the pieces of advice I give is always give me your best foot forward. Always give me the thing that you are most excited about, that you are happiest with. And you didn't do that. You didn't do that until the second time.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Most people don't get that second chance.
Yeah, nope, I know, and I find myself very fortunate.
Yeah, but again, you were doing other things. You were writing the short stories in these other universes and catching my attention by going, oh, wow, I really like that, here. And all of that was leading me to have confidence in you to take a look at that fire that second time around. And then you also really did change it.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Because we've seen that before too. It's like, well, they told me to do all these things, but they won't remember. I'll just resubmit it and then they'll love it again. No, no, we won't. We will hate it for the same reasons. Well, again, we didn't hate, but it won't be right in the same ways. There's somebody else who was talking about writing the thank you letter. That's not necessary, but But don't do what this other guy did this last week, which is he got a form rejection where it says we do not have time to state, the exact reasons why we rejected, that it's just not right for us, good luck with it someplace else. And he wrote an email to us demanding that we tell him exactly why. Well, no, and now we'll never look at anything by you again. Well done.
Now you can't follow instructions, so.
You seem not to understand English very well, so no. So yeah, there's that fine line. I understand the frustration.
Oh, yeah.
I get that entirely. I understand where that impulse comes. Just don't send that email. Send it to your mom,
But what you've just done is not only failed your audition as a writer, that you did the first time. Now you failed your audition as a professional, in any profession, doing that, because any communication is an opportunity.
Yeah.
And the bottom line is, if it's the opportunity to purge your inner demons, no, wrong opportunity. There's a different opportunity.
Not professional, adult.
Okay.
Adult, all right, there we go.
Yep.
Yeah, posting it on Facebook if you're a friend of mine too is also a bad place for that.
What? No, you're making it up.
Oh, no.
Oh.
Yes, yes, it had the dodged a bullet, got my novel rejected from Bain. It's like, okay, well then, good to know.
Wow.
Nice.
Wow.
Well, they won't be in the stable anytime soon.
Okay.
They're not even domesticated.
No.
Damn.
They're out in the
We're
wild.
talking about, audiences and knowing where your audience is and targeting, your submissions. That's all part of you being a pro and part of what you studied and you did from the very beginning. I mean, again, I don't think it's adulting. This is just something smart that you did very early on in your career. Do you have advice for young writers that
This is one of those moments when you get asked to do something and you still feel, I still feel like I'm the noob. I really do. And I think given how many people have dozens of books out there, I am still a noob in an awful lot of ways.
How many novels do you have out now?
There are 8. There's one, I don't know when Oblivion is in the pipeline. And thanks to this lady, I have lots of contracts and daily grateful for that, because that's the thing that that's another thing about Bain. Bain will give you a bunch of contracts, which actually means I can plan a life. One contract and then God forbid that, for whatever reason, your book doesn't hit right and you're not invited back, and don't call us, we'll call you, which is a story you hear so very often. I don't even know how anybody else lives with it. They're not sitting sleepless on the edge of their bed at night. But at any rate, for new authors, geez. Are there any aspiring authors in the room? Okay, so this
It's the writer's strike.
Okay, that's why we're in this room.
How do you identify your audience?
How do I identify my audience? Because it's easier, I would say, today, but I identified it, so in the days before the internet, which is really sort of an inflection point, I'd say in this question, is you go and you look at who's writing what, and of those things that you like. Okay, first thing is, what do you want to write? Know that. And I would say, I chased houses, but I did not chase a trend. And I actually think chasing a trend is probably worse than chasing a house when you get right down to it. Simply because by the time you get the novel written to essentially catch that trend, this is like surfing, trying to get on your board while the wave is curling over you.
Even in today's self-publishing, it will still take you, we'll give 6 weeks to write your novel, and, and that 6 weeks for that moment to have passed.
Yeah. Absolutely. So one of the things, know what you want to write. And I would say, whatever you start with, identify the book that you would want to write because you want to read it. You're gonna love that book. It will probably be your favorite child, or that which or it will generate your favorite Spawn, in my case. And put everything into it you can. And then you go to the store, and you've already been doing this, I would imagine, and you're looking at what things inspired me to write this, and what things like that are selling right now. You're going to learn a couple of things. You're going to learn about which houses are doing what, and then you're going to be able to go and you're going to, because even back when I was just starting, you had listservs and things like that, and you get to know who the fans are, what they're talking about, what they have very little patience for, what they don't have patience for, not so much because you're going to drive your writing towards that, but asking yourself the question, when I'm writing honestly, will I fit? And if you feel you won't, that is probably not the place to go. And there you do that work. Now, of course, in the age of the internet, we get on the other side of the inflection point, this is simplicity itself, when you get right down to it. There are so many groups. I mean, how many groups have you been mysteriously invited to and then are also a member just today? I mean, it's a daily experience for me. It's like whack-a-mole. Except for I still only have one club, but there are 19 moles out there and the invisible muskrat. They're all there. And so that's one of the ways that I get to know them. And that's one of the reasons I knew Bain. I knew that Bain because the folks there still unabashedly liked Hyman. And there was and here's the thing, you know, you say, oh, you hear a lot of very peculiar generalizations, let's say, about Bain, that readers of Bain might not care about prose that much. Every Bain reader I know who's old enough to know him loves Poole Anderson. And you show me somebody who, he may have peers, but I doubt he's second to any, in my opinion. And so my attitude is, I think sometimes, first of all, I think that the people who make these generalizations are a self-defining minority. I think most readers, the vast majority of readers, are far more open-minded than that. And I think that really what those folks are saying is that there's a certain set of prose styles which are very much au courant, and there are others which are perhaps not so much so. And I think that what I found at Bain was that I know my style, I could sort of see my style, and I know where would probably get the best reception in addition to the stories I wanted to tell. So while I created a chimera and sent it along the first time, I was delighted to see Send Me Your Next. And one of those Tony was very enthusiastic about and wanted me to submit, and it's actually waiting in that pile of things I haven't yet sent you. That's the one which is essentially the unrevealed arc. It was called Who'll Stop the Rains. It was a kludge of things, and they go out and they're on their own. And Tony said, I want to see that. And she will, but I also, part of being a professional is you clean up those contracts as fast as you can, and you don't load up more. And so I want to whack the weeds down a little bit more before I invite new to put more terrain under the plow, so to speak.
Well, fair enough. Fair enough. Now I'm excited about it again, and I want to see it. So.
All part of my shrewd plan.
All right. Well, I think we are right up at time.
Closing remarks?
None, although we were, if what time I would have for closing remarks, this was advertised as a Q&A session that maybe was, I thought, also partly the audience.
All right.
So if you guys have any.
Can you discuss your daily or weekly writing process? What do you?
That's actually one of the questions, and here's my ideal daily writing process, and I've structured my life to deliver it, and I will tell you why it doesn't always happen this way. I get up routinely either 6:30 to 7. Now I do about 40 to 50 minutes on the Nordic Track treadmill with built-in desk. You actually talk, which obviously this is a great challenge for me. The irony was lost, I suppose, or just they were too kind. Yes, and then by the notion is, so I'm diabetic too, so I actually had to start my days earlier and end them later, because if you're diabetic too and you're trying to do it without medication, the amount of time you take in the course of a day to prep your food, eat it in small bites, my God, I had no guess, and by the end of the year I realized it was hitting me for something like 8 hours a week in the workday. No matter how much I tried to push it to either side and do it the night before, it's just crazy crap. But there it is, and I want to be around to bore you, entrance you for a long time, so I'm pretty aggressive about that. I get to work at 9. I tend to write from deep immersivity. I have a little bit of ADD, not the ADHD.
That's right.
Came with the squirrel this time.
Brought us
But-
back.
and I'll tend to work in what I would say to be something like 3 or 4 hour intervals. And I realize that I've been working that long when I suddenly say to myself, damn, I have to pee. And part of that is the ADD. If you know anything about adult ADD, there's something called hyperfocus. Kids have it too, where their ability to sort of zoom down. I don't feel like I'm writing. I feel like I'm channeling. I'm there. And that's why I do a huge edit on my first drafts before I turn it in, because I do believe this is what advice for writers. If you've got the flow, don't stop it. If you see something from a later book, a later chapter, a different series, but it came to you, get it down. You live in the age of computers. That's easy to do and file, and etc. But never, when you've got energy, never put up a dike in front of it. Never put up a dam in front of it. Don't do that. Which sometimes can get in the way with your plans, because suddenly you're off and running in direction A when you really want to be finishing this.
The good news is I have all of book 4 done, but we're on book 2.
Which to an editor and a publisher is not such good news. And then I'll work straight through and stop for a slightly larger lunch, and that's my day. And I'll do that 5 days a week unless I'm coming to a con or something like that. The prep time when I'm not writing, usually the time before a book, there's about 2 weeks where I'm trying to identify all the things I want to research. When you're writing in the 1632 universe, for which the World Bible is history as we know it, which sounds on the one hand, well, that's easy. Not if you have to get it right every time, and you can't trust wiki. So there's 2 weeks that we'll go in refining the plot and making sure that I'll try to identify the things I know I'm going to need to research beforehand, because if I leave it for the period when I'm writing, then what I'm doing is I'm interrupting myself. Damn it, I can't write authoritative. That's the one thing about me as a writer that's probably the most quirky. I can't go forward if I don't believe it. I've got to know why that's happening. I've got to know that within the frame of the narrative it is consistent to the things that I've set up. Doesn't mean I have to believe in the physics of it, but because Starfire has some pretty wonky physics, right? But where exactly came from a game. What do you want? Artificial gravity? How? Don't know. Don't worry. But the thing is, I want to know how that works in that universe, and I don't want to violate that. And if I worry about that, I really can't go forward at that moment. And I'm trying to identify those icebergs before I drive my Titanic into them. So that's what my day looks like. Now, this is the quick part, because I only have to say 2 words, really, for kids. One of them is ADHD, and there's some other challenges in there, and it's the gift that keeps giving, and I love them to death. But what it does is I have to allot huge amounts of additional time. There is the time I know it would take me to complete something, and then you can never know when you have to. And because my wife works a job which is 70 hours a week and an hour commute each week, she has a V in front of her title now, vice president, which means you don't own your life anymore. So I am, when any panic button goes down, when any normative button goes down, I'm next to the red phone. And that is completely, so you make hay while the sun shines, because there's a lot of time when it doesn't.
Well, and I will say, having that as incentive keeps your ass in the chair, because you can't say, oh, well, I'll do it tomorrow. There may not be a tomorrow. You're going to be at a parent-teacher meeting, or you're going to be doing this, or you're going to be running out for the project, or whatever. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
I find, looking at writers' careers, that they are most productive during their childbearing years.
Yeah, let's go one more.
Yeah. You touched on it a little bit while you were talking about your process. During your revision process, what touchstones or points do you tend to focus on or look at?
So I'll tell you something that I actually told a friend of mine who's a really good writer, but has completionitis, and he was at a first draft and it was too big, and I said, so and this is a more detailed version of what I do. The first thing I do is, and my guess is Tony will say, thank God that you're doing this, is I look at it in not line by line. I look at it in terms of dramatic moments, scenes, exchanges, and I'm asking myself this question: do I need it? If I don't need, if I know I don't need it, I put it, I red highlight it. I don't dump it because you can always potentially use it later.
Yep.
If I'm not sure, because A, I like it, because there may be other things threaded into it that are going to be necessary for later on, I highlight that in yellow. I tend not to do what I told him to do, which was take the absolute essentials and highlight those in green. I can pretty much do that. But then after I do this, I take Word and I put it on 10% or 8% resolution, and here's what you see. It's like a graph, and the way novels tend to stretch out is there's long stretches of white, and then where there's red, there also tends to be clusters of yellow, and the problems cluster in certain areas. And then I ask myself, if I whip that whole thing out, can I make a short story out of it, use it as later bonus content, etc.? We live in the age when we don't actually have to like weep as we wield the axe. We're not killing it, we're sending it off to boarding school for a year. That's what we're doing. So that's my first step, and then once I've done that, it doesn't make any sense to do line edits before you've really whacked it down to the basics.
Yeah, you're just polishing up stuff that you're never gonna use.
Exactly. I'll do that later if I take it out of boarding school.
So where are you next, Chuck?
In this very next moment, if that's what you're asking about, I am doing we can continue this conversation in my coffee clutch in room 332. After that at 2 o'clock, you could find me at my NotCon signing at the booth of the inestimable and incomparable Glynis of the Missing Volume. And my signings, because I'm still a noob and I don't have the lines that go around the block, I'm always able to turn those into free-floating conversation zones, and I'm always delighted to do so. And then tonight, I actually I took the plunge, and I'm actually part of the pre-judging and the judging of the costumes to throw myself into the spirit of things. And in addition to my black jeans, I brought a black shirt, so I'm showing up a little bit in a modest costume attempt myself. Okay, so thank you so much for coming. Thank you, my friend.
Next in this room, we have diversity in writing.